Thank you so much for that introduction, Joanna, and it is such an unspeakable honor to be here. And thank you all for coming and listening to me. This is the story about making drawings, and it starts in Syria. A few months ago, I was in a small town on the Syrian border called Bab el-Salama, visiting an IDP camp to report for Vice. A young media activist named Youssef Halep showed me around. Youssef works for the rebel group that controls this border crossing. And in the Bab el-Salama IDP camp, 20,000 people live in the most miserable conditions imaginable. They live under dusty tarps, with their kids playing in open sewage, 2 meals a day from assorted NGOs. ISIS has car-bombed the camp 2 times, and everyone there has suffered unimaginable trauma. Yet young people like Youssef still work every day to try to cobble together a future in the face of war. Before the war, Youssef was an engineering student. His colleague Mohammed studied English literature. Now, it's their job to show around journalists, often risking death by taking us into the town of Azaz, where bombs fall 4 times a week. But they're still young guys. They're in their early 20s. They wear flip-flops. They're totally addicted to Facebook. As we were waiting for our paperwork to get done, I took out my sketchbook and I started drawing Youssef and Mohammed. Mohammed looked at me and he said, "You better be on your toes, man. I used to study art in college." And then when I finished the drawing, I showed it to Youssef. He looked at it and he said, "Man, you were a way better artist on the internet." I'm a journalist who draws pictures, or I'm an artist who does reporting. But my roots are scribbling in a sketch pad, scribbling every day to see the world or to save myself. For most of my early 20s, I sat every night till 4 a.m. on the steps of a nightclub, drawing the beautiful dancers who I wanted to be my friends. It was so dark, and I had to draw so fast to finish their acts. I drew acrobats and contortionists, singers, and it was the most amazing training for what would come later. Every night I would stay up till dawn. Then 2011 came. Occupy Wall Street happened outside my window. Zuccotti Park was just across the street. And from the first few days, I started to go down to the camp. The media had a narrative they wanted to push. They said, these people are just violent, disengaged losers. But I saw with my own eyes that this wasn't true. Within a week of Occupy starting, I started to draw the protesters. My first picture was of a construction worker holding a sign that said, "Give a damn." And we did. Since then, I've drawn countless protests in countries from Turkey to Greece to Spain. I've drawn refugee camps and labor camps. I've drawn prisons and riots. With every drawing, I try to capture people's humanity. I try to capture what makes people individual, the kid's crooked smile, a woman's sarcastic look. I drew this picture at a town in Lebanon called Tripoli. The town is torn with sectarian violence, and it's also a main landing point for refugees. This woman, Samar, fled Syria with her young son. She was tough like brass knuckles. I met her at a line where she was going to collect food coupons, and she was kind enough to pose for me. She was really into it, but her son, he really wanted to play with the other kids. She kind of goon-armed him into place. Kids, they don't like to pose. Last summer, I became one of the 4 artists in the last decade who was able to draw Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is the most American place in the world, which is what makes it so shameful for me. It's like Kafka in the Caribbean. On one hand, you have 153 men over here, indefinitely detained, kidnapped essentially by US forces and there for no reason except they're there. On the other hand, outside the barbed wire, you have a McDonald's and a gift shop. Guantanamo Bay is also one of the most censored places on Earth. Photographers, when they go there, are given something called an OPSEC briefing, which shows exactly what sort of photos they can take, right down to how many flagpoles you're allowed to have in it. And then at the end of the day, the press officers look through their cameras and delete anything they don't like. So I had an advantage. I could draw. I could use my eyes, my memory. When I went back the second time, they showed me the prisons. This is Camp Delta. The prisons were totally empty. We only saw show cells, not the prisoners. It felt like seeing a dollhouse without the dolls. It was like a Potemkin tour, and I scribbled each of these things in 5 or 10 minutes while they were dragging me from site to site. And then I was home. And when I was in my studio, working on these drawings for Vice, working on my pieces, I wanted to crystallize that divide I told you about. The horrors on one side, the force feeding that was going on when I was there, and then the cheerful Americana on the other. To create something like this, I took my memories, I took what we know, I took public information, I had a model pose for the soldiers drinking or the man being force-fed in the chair. And I drew these smiley masks, or rather dead-eyed masks, because in Guantanamo Bay, you're not allowed to draw guards. So I had to portray the censorship. Unlike photography, drawing is something that no one can take from you. You only need a surface and something to draw with, a twig, some dirt, your own blood maybe. But drawing is yours forever. In prisons from North Korea to the US, prisoners have drawn pictures to steal things back from the memory hole. They've drawn pictures to prove that they exist. I started drawing when I was 4 years old. I was not a popular child, and drawing became a way to relate to the world where, on one hand, I had a rich inner fantasy life, but on the other hand, kids would scribble death threats on my book bag. I used to draw the popular kids so that they wouldn't hit me. Artists are courtiers as often as rebels. In the gulags, they used to curry favor by drawing criminals' kids. When you're small and skilled, you learn to create these little portals of escapism, to which the powerful are as susceptible as anyone else. But that doesn't mean we like our betters any more than I like those kids that I had to bribe not to hit me. Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse, once told me that cartoonists are inherently subversive, and no matter how much we tried to hide that smirk, it keeps popping out. When I was in school, I was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, which is official American medical speak for being unable to listen to the rules. Americans love diagnoses. But oppositional defiant disorder stood me in good stead. Man, I could draw a mean picture when I was motivated by hate. This is a picture I drew of Donald Trump in Dubai. I was at a press conference and I asked him why his workers only made $200 a month. He was very upset. And in case you're wondering, his hair does look like that in person. In fact, even worse. It's kind of like a souffle, solid but airy. I think there's probably some architecture going on underneath, and in fact, maybe you could have his hairdresser over here to talk about the mechanics of that. Later, drawing gave me permission to look. Since I reached puberty, I've been getting street harassed every single day. So I learned to go through the world looking with blinders on, with this icy indifference, never letting my eyes stray around, because if I did, then guys would take it as an invitation that I wanted to sleep with them and would scream insults if I declined. Women are looked at, but art gave me the permission to look back. Where the respectable avert their gaze, artists stare. In the Renaissance, the church forbid people from dissection. It was considered desecration of corpses. But artists used to sneak into morgues and cut open bodies just so they could understand how a shoulder joint worked. In the Victorian era, women were corseted from neck to knees, but artists drew naked models. Artists took rooms in brothels. We go into courtrooms where no cameras are allowed. Our sketch pads are our excuse. There was no camera in the courtroom when the whistleblower Chelsea Manning was tried in Fort Meade. The courtroom was basically a trailer, just this tiny thing, only a few hardcore activists there to support her, wearing these black t-shirts that said truth. And in that room, Chelsea was so small. She was just this small person, her hair cropped, dwarfed by her lawyers, the prosecutors posing and strutting around her. I drew the room there to show what it felt like, just a small person surrounded by the impediments of the state. Courtrooms look like theaters or churches. This picture is at a football ultras protest in Turkey. The government wanted to install some electronic surveillance, and the football fans responded by saying, "Hell no," and throwing a bunch of smoke bombs at the cops. I support them. When I was there was a young man at the front, and he was holding a flare, like, yay. There was the water cannon here, young man here, and I dove right in front of it because I wanted to get a picture of him. He was so iconic at that moment. My picture looked terrible. All my iPhone photos looked terrible. But I went home and I drew this from that. I always wanted to use my art to distill the true line from the twit pics. In Abu Dhabi, where I was 2 months ago working on a feature for Vice, I drew migrant workers. These men are constructing museums like the Louvre or the Guggenheim. They're constructing a campus for NYU. But for 12 hours a day in the hot sun, they're making $200 a month. Abu Dhabi sticks them in these labor camps that are deep in the desert. They live 10 guys to a room, and their bosses confiscate their passports. When me and my fixer and translator went to these camps, we could not have been more fucking bizarre. We were profoundly weird. Why were we going there, asking them questions? So, when I first met these guys, I took out my sketch pad. Drawing is essentially disruptive. You're producing when you're expected to consume, but it also has the aspects of a party trick, like if you brought over a monkey in a tutu. It's showing, look, I can do something cool. Once I started drawing their friends, these guys started laughing. You gave them a big nose, they would say. And then we could talk about wages. But for all I love drawing, I sometimes ask myself, what on earth is the point? What's the point of the art I do, of going to places, doing representational images slowly, carefully, too slowly for the pace of the network? We live in a time when there have been more images than there ever were in all of human history. Foucault had the idea of the Panopticon. The Panopticon was a prison where the guard was in the center, prisoners were around, and the guards could watch the prisoners at every moment. It's often said we live in a Panopticon, but that's not wholly true. Yes, the state is watching us, but we're watching the state as well, and we're also watching each other. It's a Panopticon with 1,000 points of view. We live in a time under the gaze of the camera phone, of drones, of CCTV, of ubiquitous surveillance, of images everywhere all the time. When you're on the subway picking your nose, there might be a guy next to you surreptitiously taking your photo and uploading it to a Tumblr blog to shame people who pick their noses on the subways. We all carry with ourselves government tracking devices that we once called our cell phones, but we also use them to shoot photo and video of the government behaving badly. And when an event is in the news, all of Twitter becomes a giant eyeball. You can see everything that happens from every perspective, from idealistic protesters to indifferent bystanders to racist cops. All of it, all at once, from every point of view. A multi-eyed panopticon. There are images upon images upon images. Images taken from life and cast into the network. Images taken from the network, turned into memes and cast back into life. The images swirl past so fast. You can never get to the bottom of your Twitter stream. There are images of cat photos, of war, of your friends pouting in a bikini, of Coney Island in 1902. These photos let people who have never been heard speak. They let us see communities we have never seen. They expose state murder and they let weird kids shoot to fame. These photos, these words, prove that no one is voiceless. But I ask myself, what is the point of adding to this glut of images? Why? Why should I? I love art. I'm addicted to it. To me, it's like drinking coffee or pulling off scabs. But what am I doing? Am I doing something that has the same social utility as whittling? This photo is from Ferguson in St. Louis. What's happening in Ferguson right now is the most important thing that has happened in America for a long time. It's the most major uprising that I've ever seen, and I have barely been able to tear myself away from Twitter to stop watching it. In Ferguson, last week, cops murdered a young black man. When protesters showed up at a candlelight vigil, the cops came with dogs. They later tried to put down the protests with rubber bullets, with tear gas. In the era before the network, this would have been covered in African American media, yes. But in mainstream media, they would have dismissed it as, oh, these people are rioting, oh, the guy deserved to be shot. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live under the gaze of the camera phone. Thanks to the network, we know that the police were tear gassing kids and arresting journalists, shooting rubber bullets at the Al Jazeera camera crew and then stealing their cameras when they fled. Suddenly, the old narrative that these are people rioting for no reason looked exactly like what it was, which is a racist lie. Police were attacking protesters, and the whole world could see. The network made this an international story. So let's return to this photo. This photo is by Robert Cohen from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. A young man is picking up a tear gas canister that was shot at some kids, and he's throwing it back at the police, or throwing it away from the kids at least. And look at him there, these amazing dreads. He's holding a bag of chips. He's wearing an American flag shirt. This is the real-life Captain America here. The network fell in love with this photo. They took it, they reimagined it, they turned it into stencils, into wallpaper, into graffiti. They made it famous. The network enabled the people of Ferguson to speak to the world. And the network took this photo that was shot because of that. They ate it up and they spat it back 10,000 times in tribute. Life goes on the network. The network shapes life. Then life is captured by image makers, uploaded, decontextualized, recontextualized, demonized, and celebrated. Some newspapers even said this protester was throwing a Molotov cocktail, which just shows those papers don't know what Molotov cocktails look like. But that shows how images, even the finest ones, can be torn from their context, can be torn from their meaning. And even if the meaning of an image is true, the sheer glut of imagery and of words we have can drown it out in noise, in data, in screaming. Twitter is the place where we all crack jokes with our friends, But it's also the place where we see oppression, sorrow, and war. In our neighborhoods or halfway around the world. I sometimes wonder if humans are meant to see all this suffering everywhere and be totally unable to help. But platforms, that's another story. Twitter, Facebook, they live on our engagement. The more clicks, the more likes, the more fighting, even the more harassment and lies, they make more money and they get more data. Being distracted and superficial and vaguely traumatized is actually great business for platforms that are using us as commodities, but it's not a great plan for human beings. The network is the corrective to so many things. Marginalized voices are heard. When kids have their heads bashed in Ferguson or in Gaza, we can actually hear them, not just the voices of PR flacks that are hired to represent the head bashers. The network has given so many people the ability to see so much. It's given them the ability to shout back and to be heard. I love the internet. I love social media. I especially love Twitter, which is the modern day Agora. Everyone in this room is a child of our networked world. We are all its creatures. We were not better people before the internet, and we should never listen to anyone who tells us that we should return to some ersatz vision of Walden Pond. Online life is not inherently false. The real world, the meat space, is not inherently true. Even if this great torrent of words and pictures threatens to drown us, we should never regret that it's there. We shouldn't regret it any more than we should wish that writing would go away one day. I mean, after all, writing had its disadvantages. Before literacy, people could recite Homer's Odyssey off the top of their head. But once you can write things down, that's not so important. I mean, my memory is shot. I don't know about yours. But I think a career as an epic bard is probably beyond me. I blame writing. We are nodes of the network, but we are not its essence. The network is infinitely updating, infinitely caching, infinitely fast. Humans are not. Burnout is real, and we are not meant to consume all the knowledge in the world as if we were competitors at a Coney Island hot dog eating contest. We will always lose if we attempt to match the internet's pace. And perhaps this is one point of art in the age of the ubiquitous image. We need the multiplicity, we need all these voices, we need all these pictures, we need the everything, but we also need the singular and the one. Art can be that. When you create something slow, it's an act of resistance to the vast churn. Drawing takes place in the physical world. By looking deeply, by drawing carefully, you can get out of your head. And for the viewer, drawing is no less powerful. It is defiantly subjective. Good art tears past their defenses and into the raw edges of their heart. Art saved me. My brain was once hell. As a kid, I was a miserable child racked with depression, and it still knocks me down sometimes as an adult. But art disciplined me. It made me stop circling in my brain. It took me out of hating myself because suddenly, when I drew, I wasn't myself. I was just an apparatus for perception, just these eyes looking outward at the world and recreating it on my sketch pad. Online life is real life, and we are not separate from the loves and hates we cultivate on the internet. But meat space is real as well, and touch screens should not be our only sort of touch. We need tools that tear us from the compulsive addiction of the screen. When you draw, you're in your body. You're working with dust and mud. If you look away from the page, you can ruin it. There is no undo key for physical life. When me, my fixer, and my translator were sneaking around workers' camps in Abu Dhabi, I took photos from far away to hide the workers' identity. As is usual for my photos, they looked really bad. It was extremely dangerous for these men to speak to me. They were not citizens and they could be deported at whim. When I was home, I tried to think of single images that would sum up what I saw. I wanted to draw these guys not just as laborers, because no one is their job, whether that job is coding or whether that job is lugging rebar all day in the sun. I wanted to draw them as people. So I chose moments that were human. Guys hiding beneath a bus, sneaking a bottle of wine, or making some money cutting each other's hair on their day off. I had thousands and thousands of photos, but I only drew 5 pictures. And here is the point in my speech where I want to make you a dare. I want you to draw. I'm not saying that you're an artist or that you should be. I don't think everyone needs to be an artist any more than I think everyone needs to learn to code. We all have different specialties. But I want to persuade you to draw anyway. I want to persuade you to draw because it will crack your head apart and it will challenge your perceptions. It will pull you out of the vast world inside here and put you right back in the moment, in your body, in your eyes. And it will introduce you to a 4-cornered battlefield of paper that you will never ever win on. I have never won on that paper, but that I'm just so addicted to and to which I keep returning. You should draw because it's an act of separation from the network, and you should draw because it is a profound joy. When you draw, you look at the world anew. You take the scene in front of you. You could take that guy over here, break him into angles. I could look at how his head curves or how his arm is angled. I could stare at him and I can see, what's his expression? How does that really look? Not my stereotype of how it looks, but how is it really there? And then I can reproduce that on the sketch pad. When you draw, you're looking at the world anew. Just reality, your hands and your eyes. The network's roar fades, and you're just there with your subject, together and alone. So I dare you. After this lecture, I want you to buy a sketch pad and a pen. Don't worry about materials. Dorking about what kind of charcoal you like is for later, and ultimately that's as personal as your handwriting. But just buy them. And if you need some guidance, a pencil, skinny marker, fat marker, that's all. Every artist is different. Paul Pope draws with a brush with these big, fat, sensuous lines that I idolize, but I can never do. When I was in school, I hated fine charcoal so much that the last day I would stomp on it and turn it into dust because I was so hostile to it. And every scene calls for its own things. I drew these in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. I was working on a piece about Syrian refugees, and these people were so kind. They were so hospitable. They filled me full of coffee and shared all their cigarettes and were the most amazing people in the world, but I didn't want to abuse their kindness, and so I drew in marker so that I could get it done fast and I would be out of their hair. So you have your sketch pad, you have your pencil, you have your markers. Then you draw. That's it. You just draw. If you want an assignment, you should start by drawing your hand. And I'm choosing hand because it's really, really hard to draw your hand. It's so complicated, all these joints. But that should be where you start. And before you even pick up your pencil, just stare at it. Stare at it like you were a teenager on your first acid trip. Oh my God, so many colors. Then start sketching it, just very lightly, barely graze the paper with your pencil. Start rough and then refine. As you make lines, start interrogating yourself. Ask yourself, does my thumb really bend like that? How? Why? Why do I think that? Take your pen and use it as a ruler. Measure things like this. Don't erase. just go over it. There's a beauty to the fight, to the unsureness of drawing. If you mess up, try again. I mean, sometimes even spilling some ink across the page can look cool. Your first drawing will be terrible, and your 100th drawing will not be good. But keep going, and slowly you will start seeing the world in almost hallucinogenic richness. After you've gotten sick of drawing your hand, draw the person next to you. In New York, it's taboo to stare at someone. It can be an invite, a threat, or just like you want money. But when you draw a model, you can stare all you want, even if it feels like a transgression. Look at everything that makes them human, all of their beauties and flaws, and give yourself permission. Remember, start rough, refine. And everyone is embarrassed of their early drawings. It's natural. Unlike a photographer, you're not creating in the black box, but in front of everyone. But that's why you take photos, but you make art. And keep your sketchbook with you. It can be your weapon or your life raft. Art got me through the worst times in my life. I was a terrible student, and when I sat in school every day, I was so bored that I wanted to gouge holes in my arms. So I would draw pictures, I would draw mermaids, I would draw princesses, I would draw a whole fantasy world. I had no control over my life, but I had control over that piece of paper. And at the end of every single class, I would have this worksheet or this test filled with doodles, and the teacher would rip it out of my hand and say, "Look, class, look at this mess Molly made." I made this picture in Guantanamo Bay of their chief prosecutor while he was trying to justify the place. Just ballpoint pen from life. The world moves so fast, and the tragedy of life is that once you realize that you're in the flow of time, once you realize that you're in a moment, that moment has long ran from you, you will never have enough time to do the perfect drawing. So you train your hand. There's a lie that art is all inspiration, but it's mostly donkey work, just slaving over and over again, trying to perfect yourself so that the moment the muses comes, you'll be ready. I drew this in the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. These women looked so graceful there in their abayas that I just had to stab it down onto the sketch pad. It was like dancing with my hands. Last March, I was at the sentencing for a hacker acquaintance. He was sentenced to prison. While I was there, the prosecutors were speaking about him in this language like hackers were the new witches. And I was so angry. And then he reached for his phone, and the bailiffs beat the hell out of him in front of all of us and dragged him out, brought him back in leg irons. And there's nothing I could do then. I didn't mean to draw when I came there, but I ended up drawing anyway because there's nothing else you can do. And that's perhaps the most precious thing that art can do in our age of the Panopticon. It can pull moments out of the stream. In an age where the image is so cheap, when there are so many of them, art makes it expensive, it makes it slow, it makes it special. It says, this is important. I worked at this. Look at it. At Chelsea Manning's trial, the state did everything they could to say that it was not special, to say that this was not the most important whistleblower of our century. When they declared the verdict, it took 7 minutes. 7 minutes to dispose of a life, and 7 minutes was all I had to draw this before the soldiers kicked everyone out. Now Chelsea Manning is locked in prison. She'll be locked there for decades. The state locks people in cages without community, without context, without love. They become not themselves, but widgets passing through this great machine. A few months after her trial, Chelsea Manning's support network contacted me and asked me to draw her as the woman that she knows herself to be. They even sent me a self-portrait she had done. She's I think, a pretty fine artist. And I drew this from that as carefully as I could, to say, remember, even though the American government wants you to forget. When I drew Chelsea, she was somewhere the network could no longer look. The network is so good at delivering images that we are tempted to believe that it's perfect, that it's all-seeing. It is not. The state may be able to look at us, but we are not able to look perfectly back. Cell phones have kill switches. Cameras can be smashed. Borders, prisons, government offices are all off limits. But a sketchpad can go places that cameras cannot look. In Guantanamo, prisoners are unpersons. The vast majority of men who have been imprisoned there are held indefinitely. Their charges would not have been known if Chelsea Manning hadn't leaked them. Their identities are classified. Their faces are forbidden from being photographed. Guards address them only as numbers. When I drew these pictures, I had only a few minutes to look at them through a one-way mirror so they didn't know that I was there. I was forbidden from drawing their faces, and the press escorts with me looked through my sketchpad to make sure that I had scribbled them out. After I got back, a lawyer who represents a number of Guantanamo prisoners gave me Red Cross photos. They were these miserable-looking things, just, this poor guy under fluorescent light, these bureaucratic, icy objects. But I drew from them. I drew with all the care that I would give to drawing a famous actress. I drew so that they could not be erased. When you draw, you're feeding that image with your sweat and with your blood. I get tendinitis in my right hand from drawing too much. I have to periodically pay a nice man to electrocute it so it starts working again. And when I'm in the studio, I just kind of punch it to make it go back to life. But I keep drawing anyway, even if it hurts, even if my eyes blur, even if my hand stops being able to hold a pen. I draw because it is all that I can do. When I got back to Syria, when I went to Syria, I was so grateful for the help of Yusuf Halep, of Mohammed, of the media activists who were risking their lives to show me a sliver of their country. So I drew these pictures of them, and I sent it to them on Facebook. And Yusuf Halep said, "Yeah, okay, maybe you are pretty good. You just weren't so good at drawing from life." Thank you, Yusuf Halep. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, everyone who showed me Syria. And thank you, every single person who's ever posed for a drawing. Thank you, my subjects. I am forever skeptical of the utility of art. Artists are usually Fabergé egg makers pretending to be revolutionaries. And I don't believe that drawing can change the world, at least not often. But I draw anyway, and you should draw anyway, because even if it can't change the world, it might change you. Art is the discipline of seeing. To draw is to discard visual stereotypes. It's to forget you knew what a nose looked like. It's to stare at fire as it flickers and burns. Before you even worry about the marks you make, you train yourself in observation. So I want you to draw. When you leave here, I want you to draw. And when you draw, look hard. Look at beautiful dancers. Look at powerful hypocrites. Look at the old lady collecting bottles to make recycling money. Look at acrobats reaching for the sky. Look at everything that compels you and everything you've been afraid of. Look at what disgusts you, what fills you with joy. Look where you didn't dare. When you leave this room, I want you to buy a sketch pad. I want you to buy a pen. And then I want you to draw. I dare you to draw. And when you do, I want you to look at the world around you. Look at it as hard as you can, as truly as you can. I want you to see like you've never seen before. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Molly Crabapple.